Good morning, class 11. Today we will be discussing a new chapter, that is chapter number 2. We are not afraid to die if we can all be together, written by Gordon Cook and Alan East. So, Europeans are enterprising and adventure loving, and these very qualities enable them to sail around the world and discover new routes, new lands, and ultimately colonize them, right? And a few countries ruled over nearly half of the world, like England. And this closeness to sea and their better experiences of tempests and storms made them strong enough to challenge death, right? So this lesson is written by Gordon Cook and Alan East, and the story is about a 37-year-old businessman who is the narrator of the story. And he has a wife named Mary and two children. Jonathan, his age was 6, and Susanne, her age was 7. And he and his wife both dream of a voyage around the world on the ship Wave Walker. And the description of Wave Walker, the Wave Walker, it is a 23-meter long, 30-ton wooden hulled, just like that of the famous Captain James Cook. And the whole family started sailing from Plymouth, England on July 1976. And the initial phase of the 3-year long journey was from Africa to Cape Town. And it was pleasant while heading east along with two newly hired crewmen, and strong waves hits them and their survival become a question. And the story tells us about how they fought each day and survived till the end. So here we will find the character list: the narrator, the captain of the ship Wave Walker, Mary, the wife of the narrator; Jonathan, 6-year-old son of the narrator; Susanne, 7-year-old daughter of the narrator. Then we will find two young men: Larry Vigil, American crewman hired from Cape Town, and Herb Seiger, Swiss crewman hired from Cape Town. Okay. So let's read out the first page number 13, and I will explain. In July 1976, my wife Mary, son Jonathan, 6, daughter Susanne, 7, and I set sail from Plymouth, England, to duplicate the round the world voyage made 200 years earlier by Captain James Cook. For the longest time, Mary and I, a 37-year-old businessman, had dreamed of sailing in the wake of the famous explorer, and for the past 16 years, we had spent all our leisure time honing our seafaring skill in British water. Honing our seafaring skill means improving the skill required to travel by sea. Okay. And our boat, Wave Walker, a 23-meter 32 wooden hulled beauty, had been professionally built, and we had spent months fitting it out and testing it in the roughest weather we could find. So here the narrator is 37-year-old businessman, and he, along with his wife Mary and two children, Jonathan and Susanne, went on a voyage on their ship in July 1976. And they started from Plymouth, England, and they wanted to complete the sea trip around the world, just like one that had been completed 200 years ago, but the fact by the famous Captain Cook. And the narrator and his wife spent 16 years in improving their seafaring skill, 16 years. And they got a ship built professionally, a 23-meter long and 30-ton heavy wooden hull, and it's named Wave Walker. And they look several months to test in the roughest of weather. Okay. Voyage means a journey, a long journey by the sea or space. Okay. Now in the next part. The first leg of our planned 3 years. 105,000-kilometer journey passed pleasantly as we sailed down the west coast of Africa to Cape Town. There, before heading east, we took on two crewmen, American Larry Vigil and Swiss Herb Seigler, to help us tackle one of the world's roughest seas, the southern Indian Ocean. So, here the initial phase of the 3 year long journey of 105,000 kilometers passed pleasantly. Okay, and they sailed down the west coast of Africa to Cape Town, and the narrator hired two crewmen before heading towards the east to tackle the roughest sea of the southern Indian Ocean. And the narrator, hired two young men named Larry Vigil, an American, and Herb Segler, a Swiss. And on the second day in the Cape Town, they encountered a strong wind which continued for several weeks. And a strong wind was not a problem, but 15 meters high waves, which were the highest of the mast, worried the narrator. Okay, here I have written the explanation. Go through it. December 25 found us 3,500 kilometers east of Cape Town. Despite atrocious weather, we had a wonderful holiday complete with a Christmas tree. New Year's Day saw no improvement in the weather, but we reasoned that it had a change soon, and it did change for the worse. At dawn on January 2, the waves were gigantic. We were sailing with only a small storm jib and were still making 8 knots. As the ship rose to the top of each wave, we could see endless enormous seas rolling towards us, and the screaming of the wind and spray was painful to the ears. To slow the boat down, we dropped the storm jib and lashed a heavy mooring rope in a loop across the strain. Then we double lashed. Everything went through our rat drill, attached lifeliness, doomed oilskins and life jackets, and waited. So on December 25, the narrator and his group had traveled 3,500 kilometers east of the Cape Town. And in the Wave Walker, they celebrated Christmas together, but the weather was bad, and the weather remained the same till New Year's Day, but they hoped for it to change soon. But the weather's conditions worsened, and on the early morning of January 2, the waves were very huge, and they were sailing with a small storm jib. Jib means, a triangular staysail set for the mast in a ship. Okay. And on January 2, the waves were very huge, and they were sailing with a small storm jib at a speed of 8 knots. And when the ship was sailing with the huge waves, they could see the huge sea in front of them, and the noise of the waves and the strong winds was painful for the author and their ears. And they dropped the storm jeep to slow down the ship and hid a heavy mooring rope across the black part of the ship in a loop. And they lost everything with double force. They put on their oilskins and life jackets and attached life nets and went through the life raft drills and waited and waited. The first indication of impending disaster came at about 6 p.m. with an ominous silence. Ominous silence, you know, it means unpleasant or threatening silence. Okay, ominous. That means, a bad thing is about to come, right? Unpleasant silence. The wind dropped and the sky immediately grew dark. Then came growing roar and an enormous cloud toward aft, aft of the sea. With horror, I realized that it was not a cloud, but a wave like no other I had ever seen. It appeared perfectly vertical and almost twice the height of the other waves, with a frightful breaking crest. So, around 6 p.m., an unpleasant silence rolled over the weather, and it was an indication of a disaster which was about to happen. And the wind suddenly dropped, and the sky was darker with heavy clouds, and a huge cloud was coming towards the stern of the ship. But later the narrator realized that it was a huge wave, and the wave was perfectly vertical and it was twice the height of the previous waves, and they saw with the top of the wave looking unpleasant due to its height. Right. The roar increased to a thunder as the stern moved up the face of the wave, and for a moment I thought we might ride over it. But then a tremendous explosion shook the deck. A torrent of green and white water broke over the ship, and my head smashed into the wheel, and I was aware of flying overboard and skimming below the waves. I accepted my approaching death, and as I was losing consciousness, I felt quite peaceful. So the thunder increased, and the wave moved the strain up, and the author and his group thought that it would not do any damage, but a huge explosion vibrated the deck, and a strong moving stream of green and white water broke over the ship, and the narrator's head smashed into the wheel of the ship, and he flew overboard and sank below the waves. And he accepted that his death was approaching, and he started losing consciousness, and that felt quite peaceful for him. And unexpectedly, my head pooped out of the water a few meters away. Wave Walker was near capsizing, her masts almost horizontal. Then a wave hurled her upright. My lifetime jerked taut. I grabbed the guard rails and sailed through the air into Wave Walker's main boom. Subsequent waves tossed me around the deck like a ragdoll. My left ribs cracked, my mouth filled with blood and broken teeth. Somehow I found the wheel, lined up the stern for the next wave, and hung on. So, and the front hatch was thrown open, and Mary appeared. We are sinking, she screamed, and the decks are smashed. We are full of water. Take the wheel, I shouted as I screamed for the hat. So the narrator's head pooped out of water, and the ship was about to overturn, but a wave turned her upright. His lifeline jacket was stretched. He grabbed the guardrail and sailed to the ship's main pole. And the waves tossed him around the deck, and he was injured as his left rib cracked and his mouth full with blood, and he had a broken tooth. He found the wheel, lined the strain for the next wave, and waited. And there was water everywhere, and the narrator couldn't feel water below the ship, but he didn't leave the wheel alone. And suddenly the front door opened, and his wife, Mary, came screamingly, and she told that they are sinking. Then the narrator handed her the wheel and climbed towards the door. Now, in page number 15. Larry and Herb were pumping like madmen. Broken timbers hung at crazy angles. The whole starboard side bulged towards cloth, crockery, charts, tins, toys sloshed about in deep water. I half swam, half crawled into the children's cabin. Are you all right? I asked. Yes, they answered from an upper bunk. But my head hurts a bit, said Sue. Sue means Suzanne. Pointing to a big bump above her eyes, I had no time to worry about bumped heads. After finding a hammer, screws, and canvas, I struggled back on deck with the starboard side best open. We are taking water with each wave that broke over us, and if I couldn't make some repairs, we would surely sink. So the crewmen Larry and Herb were pumping the water very fast, and the timbers of the ship were broken and were hanging badly. Timbers means wooden board used in building of a ship. And the starboards of the ship had sunk. Clothes, crockery, charts, tins, and toys were roaming around in deeper water. And the narrator swam and crawled to the children's cabin and asked the children whether they are all right. And the children replied that they are all right, but his daughter complained about a big bump on her head. And the narrator didn't pay much attention to it, and as his major concern was to save them, so the narrator found screws, hammer, and canvas and went back to the deck. And the broken starboard side was letting so much water in. That's why the narrator could not fix the problem, and he realized that if he couldn't fix the problem, they would all sink in the sea. Somehow I managed to stretch canvas and secure waterproof hatch cover across the gaping holes, and some water continued to stream below. but most of it was being deflected over the side. More problem arose when our hand pumps started to block up, with the debris floating around the cabins, and the electric pump short circuited. The water level rose threateningly. Back on deck, I found that our two spare hand pumps had been ranged overboard, along with the forestay sail, the jib, the dinghies, and the main anchor. Then I remembered we had another electric pump under the chart room floor. I connected it to an out pipe and was thankful to find that it worked. So here the narrator stretched the canvas cloth and screwed the waterproof hats which covered the gaping holes, and some water screamed below and some was not deflected over the side, and the hand pump was blocked as rubbish was floating around the cabins, and the water level rose. The narrator found two hand pumps had been removed along with rope, zip, and small boat and the main anchor. And he found another electric pump under the chart room and he connected it to an out pipe, and he was happy that it was working. The night dragged on with an endless, bitterly cold routine of pumping, steering, and working the radio. We are getting no replies to our mayday calls. Mayday calls, it's a word used to signal ships stuck in a disastrous situations through radio. Okay. Which was not surprising in this remote corner of the world. Sue's head had swollen alarmingly. She had two enormous black eyes, and now she showed us a chip cut on her arm. And when I asked why she hadn't made more of her injuries before this, she replied, I didn't want to worry you when you were trying to save us all. So here the whole night was about the endless routine of pumping out the water, steering the wheel, and working the radio. There were no replies to their signals sent over the radio as they were in the remotest part of the world. And Susan's head was swollen, and she had two back eyes with a deeper cut in her arm. And the author asked her why she didn't tell him about her injuries earlier. Then she replied that she didn't want to worry him as he was trying to save them all. Right? Please go through the PDF, and I have given 3 questions to be attempted as homework. Right? Try to write the answer of these questions. In the next class, we'll start the next part of the story. Okay? Thank you.